Gene,
Good morning.
it's nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. I've been going over your work and incredible stuff, man. I really love it.
Thank you.
So many different topics that you cover. I'm hoping today we can kind of learn a little bit about you and kind of where you started at and then kind of go on from there. So
Sounds great.
yeah. So how did you start? Is this something that you started as a younger man, like getting into, or is this something you kind of over time started digging into?
Well, I grew up in Denver and then Los Angeles. My dad would go back and forth between Denver and Los Angeles because his mom lived in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
They were my people came from Spain and Mexico. From Spain they came in the early 1700s and settled in New Mexico. And then my dad's side of the family is on his mother's side. They came from northern Mexico, from the state of Nuevo León and that area near Monterrey, Mexico. And they settled in southern Colorado, near Pueblo, Colorado, Trinidad. I have relatives in Trinidad, Pueblo, all up and down the Rocky Mountains, actually, and on into New Mexico. And so as a kid, I would always be going down to New Mexico or to California because after both of my grandfathers in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico passed away, my grandmothers moved with some of their kids to Los Angeles. So we went back and forth between New Mexico, California, Denver, where I grew up. And we had, relatives we didn't have to stay at Motel 6 or anything. We just would stay with relatives all along around. So that was always fun. But, when I'd sit around listening, especially at my grandmother on my mother's side, my grandmother Ortiz in northern New Mexico in Raton, every night after supper, everybody would gather in El Salon, the living room, and sit down, and before you know it, they were telling different stories about when their ancestors first came to New Mexico, and they had interactions with the various Indians, Plain Indians, Comanches, others who were in that area. And I was always fascinated by those stories. And as I got older, I later took a dictaphone with me, and I would record some of my relatives down there because their stories were fascinating. Mm-hmm. And that's really where I learned my love of history. So I've loved history ever since. I pursued education in my career. And it was interesting how out of 6 kids, I became a person that really loved going to school and being educated at different levels. So when the Vietnam era came and I was 18, I had to go down to the draft board and apply for the draft status. And kind of fortunately, I had really bad eyesight at that time. So I had to take a deferment. I was actually going to try to get into the Air Force during the Vietnam era war. And they said, well, your eyesight's not good enough. And in fact, we're going to have to give you a deferment, which I was kind of disappointed, but at the same time, it was a boon and a blessing for me not to go to Vietnam. I could have ended up on Hamburger Hill like a lot of GIs did, going into combat. So I went to college, and I remember a shop teacher that I had. I took him for blueprint reading and drawing, from auto repair to welding. And I was in welding class one day, and Mr. Noyce was standing over me, and he was seeing me weld. And he said, Chavez, he called me Chavez. He says, Chavez, you need to think about going to college. I said, what? I said, don't you think I can weld a good bead or what? And he said, no, you're doing fine, but you're smart. You need to go to college. And so he was a teacher that I had in shop classes. And by the way, back then, people were tracked into various tracks: industrial track, business track, college track. Mm-hmm. And I was in the industrial track. So so when I went to my counselor at Manual High School in Denver, where I was, she said, well, most Mexicans don't go into college. You need to think about a career in, industry. And so she gave me that spiel, and I kind of followed my heart and leadings. I think it was divine leading for my part to decide to go to college. And so my senior year of high school, I went to a small Christian school in Kirksville, Missouri, of all places. And I started to study, and I really enjoyed studying. And the fact that it was a small Christian school, the teachers were just like tutors. I mean, not only did they teach you in class, but I lived on the campus of that small school, and was able to call upon them to get special tutoring and all of that. So the next year, I decided to go to what is called today Kansas Bible College in Overland Park. And that's really how I first came to the Kansas City area in 1961. And so coming here, I would ask, well, where's the Mexican community in Kansas City? And I said, well, they're down there in Argentine, Armourdale, the west side. Mm-hmm. That was the Colonia Mexicana at that time. And so I would go down there and, eat, get to know the people. I worked in a small church on Metropolitan Avenue as a Sunday school teacher. And the church was held in Spanish, so I was able to keep my Spanish alive because I grew up speaking Spanish. And of course, you can speak it, but you don't often know the grammar and all the proper way to speak it. But so having that opportunity to work in the Argentine area at a small Church of the Nazarene, I was able to get to know the community, the Mexicano community, and I soon discovered then Armourdale and Kansas City, Missouri's west side. So from 1961 to 1964, I was in Overland Park, but doing a lot of interaction with the people of those communities. And then in 1964, I met my wife at the Bible College, and we got married and decided to go up to Northeast Missouri State University to get our teacher's degrees. So we went up to Northeast Missouri State, which is today Truman State. And I pursued a degree in secondary education. She pursued a degree in elementary ed. And we had a lot of credits from the Bible College that were accepted. So it took us 2 years to finish up our degrees in Kirksville, and then moved back to Kansas City in 1966. And my wife taught in Olathe Public Schools, and I taught at the Bible College and continued my work in the Latino communities. So that's really how I became acquainted with Kansas City's Latino population. In '69, moved back to Denver and worked in Denver in a number of programs, community center, as program director, and then I took a job with OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and became director of one of the action centers. And when Nixon did away with the Office of OEO, my job was gone, and it was okay because then I got a job with the largest manufacturer of Portland cement, coordinating affirmative action. And they had major contracts. It was called Ideal Basic Industries. And they were the largest producer of Portland cement in the world, actually, headquartered in Denver. And I had met in my work in the Denver Latino community, the wife who was a volunteer at some of the things that we were doing in the community, of the treasurer of Ideal Portland, Ideal Basic Industries. And she said, hey, they're looking for somebody to coordinate affirmative action because they have all these contracts to do the Eisenhower Tunnel, the Alaskan Pipeline, and they have to come into compliance with minority hiring. And so I said, hey, I'd love to do that. So I got involved with Ideal Basic Industries.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to stop you right there. I'm sorry. Okay. Is that your jacket rubbing? I'm sorry.
This one?
Yeah, those mics are so sensitive. I think your jacket's been rubbing the whole time. It'll pick up everything. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But no, go ahead.
Okay.
What were you saying?
Yeah. So I coordinated affirmative action for that corporation for 3 years, basically, and helped them start coming into compliance with OEO requirements. Equal economic opportunity was EEO. And it was a challenge because, of course, there was a lot of racism and anti-Latino and other ethnic populations. Oh, you're trying to make me hire people even though they're not qualified. I said, wait a minute. I said, I'll bring qualified applicants and you hire the best of the qualified applicants, and regardless of race. And so that's how we were able to get the company to come into compliance. Well, in 1976, 10 years after we had graduated from Northeast Missouri State, because we graduated in 1966, it was now 10 years fast forward into my work in Denver. And then my wife and I decided we wanted to go get our master's degrees, and her sister and husband and family were in Tempe, Arizona, at Arizona State. So they said, hey, why don't you come down here and pursue your graduate degrees? So that's what we did. We went down there, and my wife got her master's in as a reading specialist, and I got mine in cross-cultural counseling. And then I decided to go on for a doctorate. I was working in the Center for Multicultural Education at Arizona State as a graduate associate. And so I got hooked up with them and decided to get a doctoral degree in secondary ed in the area of understanding why we do the things we do in education. So my doctorate is in social cultural foundations of education, and with an emphasis in bilingual multicultural ed. And so that prepared me to enter into various educational situations where I could teach at the college level and so forth. So after we finished at ASU, we moved back to Denver, and I worked at the University of Colorado at Boulder in their Center for Multicultural Education. And then in 1983, my wife's mother, who lived in Overland Park, was starting to get up there in age and needed us to be close to her, because her husband had passed away. And so we moved back to Kansas City, to Overland Park, and I went back to teaching at the Bible College in Overland Park. And then besides working at the college teaching classes, I started an organization called Center for Intercultural Communications, and doing consulting with school districts, with businesses on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. We didn't call it that back then. It was called, cultural diversity training, that type of thing.
Was that something new?
Well, it was relatively new at that time, and then now it's evolved to be called equity, inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay,
is what most people who are working in this field of trying to help the society understand diversity issues and to take the step of inclusion. And so that I was able to do that for a number of years in different settings. I had my own not-for-profit organization where we did that and helped entities do that. So fast forward a little bit, I took a position with the district, Kansas City, Kansas school district as a counselor, and did that for a number of years in the Kansas City, Kansas public schools. And then after about 9 years with the district, an opportunity opened up on the Missouri side to work in their district as a counselor, as a high school counselor. And I was working as a counselor in the KCK district as well. And then I moved over to the Missouri side and worked from 2004 to 2013 as a high school counselor at Northeast High School, and then at East High School when it opened again as a high school. It reverted to an elementary school for a while. But so, you know, my career has kind of followed a path mostly in the area of education. So, you know, I feel very pleased that I was able to do that.
It sounds like different positions too. Like it wasn't all the same. I mean, you went from counselor to also other things you've done. So a wide array of different positions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Well, so anyway, that's kind of a long story of how I got started in history. So when I in all of those positions, I was always interested in continuing my understanding of history, particularly of the Latino people. And so I, did writing in 1995 when Joe Arce started KC Hispanic News. He asked me to be a writer for KC Hispanic News on issues of history. And so I started writing, and so in all of the back issues, if you look from 1995, you can see a lot of history articles that I wrote back then.
What kind of issues of history?
Well, I really choose I would choose any topic that interested me, and Joe gave me that liberty. Gotcha. I would do a lot of local issues.
Oh, okay.
And interview, for example, people who had migrated here from Mexico, and then tell their stories in news articles. But I also did other things. I did a whole series on the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement. I did a whole series on Cesar Chavez for the paper, and in a special edition because at that time we were working to change the street in the west side from 23rd Street to Avenida Cesar Chavez. So Joe wanted me to write a whole series of articles on Cesar Chavez.
Did you find that in going throughout Kansas City's history, especially for the Latino community, did you find a lot of errors and just things that weren't right from what you've researched?
Well, the few things that I found were pretty accurate. Okay. I mean, it was well researched. There was a dissertation that, and I forget the person who did that, but it's on file, about the Argentine community, the Mexican community in Argentina. So that was a doctoral dissertation that somebody had done out of KU. And it was really pretty accurate. There were other things that were documented by some of the early Mexicano writers, and of course Irene Ruiz on the west side. She loved history, and she was always documenting things, and she did a whole series of oral histories on cassette tapes that she collected
Really?
different people. Yeah, and those are at the Missouri Valley Room. And so it's first-person interviews that she did with some of the early people of Kansas City who were, sometimes just residents, and sometimes they were leaders.
And people are able to go and actually check those out?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
that's awesome.
they're there. So, I did research with those archives, but what I found is that there were very few people writing very much about Kansas City's Latino history.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and especially the Mexican-American history. So that was really where I felt like I needed to focus on Kansas City's history and try to portray it in all of its diversity, as well as be as accurate about documenting that history.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to go over today was the actual migration of Mexicans from Mexico to Kansas City. And I know the biggest reason was because of the railroads and jobs. Could you take us down kind of a backstory of that?
Well, and I would even go back further than the period of the Mexican Revolution, where the majority of Mexicans came to the Kansas City area. Uh-huh. I'm going to go back to the Sante Fe Trail.
Okay, I was reading some of that. Yeah.
Yeah. When you think about Kansas City, it really truly is the gateway to the West. Mm-hmm. Now, St. Louis claims that title. And in their...
I heard Independence was actually...
Independence played a role at the Sante Fe Trail.
Yeah, because that documentary that I actually bought said something about St. Louis claiming, but Independence was actually the true start of it or something like that.
Yeah. Let me trace that a little bit.
Yeah.
So St. Louis really was under Spanish control in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Mm-hmm. So think about when the Louisiana Purchase took place. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1802, 2 and 3, and then the Corps of Discovery of Lewis and Clark took place from 1804 to 1806. Because of the purchase that President Jefferson made of the Louisiana Purchase. But that territory, previous to that period of early 1800s, was really under Spanish control. Mm-hmm. So all the way from New Orleans up the Mississippi River and out west on the Missouri River is what we call the Louisiana Territory. Mm-hmm. The reason why it was called Louisiana, it was named after a French monarch, because the French had claimed that all in the name of their king, King Louis. And so it became Louisiana, spelled in the French a little differently than we spell it in English, or even the Spanish, because the Spanish called it Louisiana and the French called it Lucien. But it was under Spanish control. So the Spanish governors, Galvez, down in what is today Galveston Island, controlled all of that area. And they would have Spanish governors establish forts and so forth. A guy by the name of Manuel Lisa established a trading post in St. Louis under the Spanish, and he became a commissioner of Indian Affairs under the Spanish governor. They had a succession of Spanish governors that controlled that whole area, all the way from New Orleans, all the way up to past Omaha, Nebraska, and all of that area, and for points further west, which was largely undiscovered by Europeans. But then when the French monarchy fell and the French Republic was established and Napoleon took over, he basically took back the Louisiana territory from the Spanish. They had allied with France during the period of what was called the 7-Year War, and as a gift, the French monarch had given the Spanish control over Louisiana, made it their territory. But then when Napoleon came into power, he took it back and said, hey, I'm going to sell it because I need money to finance all my wars. He was wanting to move from Europe into northern Africa to do some conquering and claim it for.
I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Try not to tap on the table because they're very sensitive. They pick up all that stuff. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Yeah. So when Napoleon basically sold the territory to Jefferson, it had recently been under Spanish control and now reverted back to France. And he sold it quickly, made some money on it, and continued his wars in Europe and Northern Africa. So the Spanish, so think about Latinos, the broader term, under the Hispano rule, the Spanish rule, that was all territory. The same is true about the Spanish Empire. It reached all the way up to the Arkansas River. Arkansas River runs from out of Colorado mountains in through, sort of cuts through Kansas, and it goes on down to, like Great Bend, Kansas, to Wichita, Kansas, and then down into Arkansas. So the Spanish Empire had its territory all the way up to that river. When Mexico gained its independence in 1821, that was the same year that Missouri became a state, 1821. Oh, okay. Yeah. So in 1821, a very significant date in Latino history is that Mexico, under the various government officials of now Mexico, an independent nation, they decided that they wanted to trade with the United States. Under the Spanish rule, the Spanish did not want to trade with the United States. They were basically an enemy. But they had allied with the United States in the Revolutionary War. But they knew that the United States was pushing to gain territory and had already gained, parts of what was previously Spanish Empire in the sale of the Louisiana Purchase and acquisition of the United States of all that territory. So they were losing territory, and they didn't want this under the Spanish government. They didn't want to, sell out any more territory. So what they did is the Spanish under now they prohibited. They had an embargo, if you will, on American goods, and so when Mexico gained its independence, they lost that relationship that they had with Spain that used to bring manufactured goods into the Spanish Empire and be distributed along what was called Los Caminos Reales, the royal roads that the Spanish built throughout their empire, and including all the way up to Sante Fe, New Mexico. That was all part of El Camino Real that came up from Mexico City up to Sante Fe, which was their northernmost territorial capital, if you will. And that's why Sante Fe became important. Mm-hmm. So when Mexico gained its independence in 1821, they threw the doors open to trade with the United States because they needed it, because they weren't getting manufactured goods from Spain as they had originally gotten them. And so the advantage to both countries was that they could trade their various goods. The Spanish, or the Mexicanos now, and a lot of people think of Mexicanos as a race or an ethnic group, but it's really a national group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when you say Mexican, it could be a German who migrated to Mexico and they're considered Mexican. It could be an Indian from one of the various indigenous tribes, a Zapotec. For example, Benito Juarez was the first and only full-blooded Indian. He was Zapotec Indian, educated by priests who became president of Mexico. But not many other Indians or even mestizos, yes, but mostly people of European descent have become presidents and are at the higher echelons. You know, they're the Mexican elite. So, and they're not necessarily Indian or even mestizo. That is mixture of Indian and European, or mulatto, which is mixture of many of the slaves that existed that were brought to Mexico, especially the East Coast. So when you think about Mexicanos and their history, it really started in 1821, same year that Missouri became a state. So that trade relationship along a trail called the Sante Fe Trail from Independence, Missouri to Sante Fe, New Mexico started. And the reason why Independence was important was because of the fact that there was a river, steamship riverboat port in Independence, Missouri. There wasn't one down in Westport, right? That is Westport Landing, where the bottoms, the West Bottoms are today. So when in 1821, again, Missouri becoming a state, Mexico becoming independent from Spain, where the riverboats would land in Independence, Missouri, the only port that there was along the Missouri River for riverboats to bring manufactured goods. They were offloaded in Independence and then brought by wagon all the way to Sante Fe, New Mexico. They now had a land route. And the reason why that land route was important, and it was, by the way, a land route that the Indians and the Spanish and the French used for centuries, long before it became used by Americans as the Sante Fe Trail.
Okay.
So it was a connection. And that connection, when Spanish, say, controlled Louisiana, the people from northern New Mexico, what is today northern New Mexico, then it was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, they would send their kids to St. Louis because that was the closest university. There was a Jesuit university called St. Louis University today, still running, still operating, where the Spanish elite would send their children to go to school for higher education. There was also a women's college, the first college established by Sisters of Loretto in St. Louis, and the women would go to that college. It was the first women's college west of the Mississippi. So those two orders, the Jesuits and the Sisters of Loretto, were both into education and had established those two places. It was closer for the people of northern New Mexico to send the Spaniards to send their children to St. Louis than it was to send them to Mexico City, which had one of the very first universities in the New World. Yeah, along with Lima, Peru, and then Harvard came along later, and other places as far as universities. So that history goes way back. Latinos have been coming to this area for centuries, long before even the 1821 Sante Fe Trail. So Spaniards were coming up, and St. Louis was the first settled, by French and Spanish people.
Gotcha.
And then the Sante Fe Trail in 1821 became important because Mexico opened up their trade, and the United States settlers were moving further and further west, and by 1848, when gold was discovered in California, that's when the United States said, well, a little before that, President James Polk said, hey, we want to expand, and so we're going to launch a war against Mexico. And there was a war between 1846 and 1848 called the Mexican War. I call it the United States War of Aggression against Mexico, where the U.S. found a reason to basically conquer Mexico. So under President James Polk, American troops were sent into Mexico, and the Mexican War took place. And it was settled by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, when the Mexicans said, okay, yeah, you guys won, you know. And by the way, that's where most of the Civil War, American Civil War soldiers out of West Point, the generals and all that, were trained. That was their first opportunity to have any kind of big battle. And they easily won over a fledgling young country like Mexico. Mm-hmm. They didn't have the resources to fight against the United States government.
The United States just wanted to expand, basically more territory.
Yeah, exactly. So as American settlers began moving west, not only along the Louisiana Purchase, but on into California and other places in the West, there was a big market for manufactured goods as white settlers moved west. And of course to the Latino world, because they had all that system of roads, los caminos reales. And so they were no longer getting manufactured goods through Spanish channels. They now traded with the United States. So that's how independence, and then later Kansas City, because Kansas City, when trade first started along the Sante Fe Trail, Kansas City didn't even exist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was later founded right down on the bottoms where the West Bottoms are today. And
so that was the origination of Kansas City.
That was down there where Kansas City originated. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Joseph McCoy and a couple of other people were trappers. Basically, they were traders and trappers. Engaged in the fur trade, which was big in all of the Louisiana area. Because the Indians trapped beaver and other small animals, and then sold the pelts. And then later, buffalo hides became a big thing further west in the plains. But so when the Louisiana Purchase took place, there was mostly just fur trappers out here. Then people began to settle, and the American way of moving westward and getting settlers into the area. You have to remember that. When it comes to land, you can claim the land, but unless you possess it, that's where we got the old saying, possession is 90% of the law. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you can claim something, but unless you claim land, unless you go in and inhabit it, and work it, it's just land sitting out there, and people think, well, it's up for grabs. And that's really what the United States kept doing. They kept moving settlers. They kept moving Indians off the land and offering it to white settlers. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was based on a capitalist system where not only were we going to invite settlers to come in, we're going to actually sell it to them, even though it's maybe $1 an acre. But that allowed them then to plat the land and began to sell parcels of the land. And so that's the way American settlement took place, is that the land was claimed, possessed, moved off anybody who would dispute that, and then parceled and sold. And that's how settlements took place westward. So they needed all that land as people began to move further and further west and engage in agriculture. That was really the biggest industry. Missouri, for example, became the largest producer of hemp, not the marijuana plant, but the hemp fiber that was used to make burlap and rope, hemp rope for the cotton industry. So all along the Missouri River, it was important to have that land and to grow hemp that was, and so the settlers from Virginia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Tennessee, Southerners of those areas brought their enslaved people with them into Missouri. Mm-hmm. And that's why Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, because all of those settlers had brought enslaved people with them, or purchased them here as they were shipped in by riverboat and so forth. So, the history of the Latino really started way back during the Louisiana period, when it was part of Spain, and then later in the period of the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1921. That was a period when the mass migration, over 1 million people left Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. Many of those million who left, a few went to Europe if they had, Spanish roots, and had family in Spain and other places in Europe. They went to Europe. The elite, basically. Many of the workers who left the war-torn Mexico would migrate north. And during that period, 1910 to 1921, was the period of World War I, when many of the men of the United States were sent off to European theaters of war. And so there was a huge labor shortage. And so Mexican workers were welcomed in the United States to come and work not only in agriculture, which was a big thing, because back then sugar production around sugar beet growing and planting and harvesting provided Great Western Sugar Company to build a huge sugar manufacturing empire throughout the territories of New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska. So it was a huge crescent. In fact, my father's family that had migrated to Trinidad went up to Pueblo and began to work the sugar beet industry. And the way the sugar beet industry worked is they would have the Mexican families travel in boxcars. They converted boxcars into little houses on wheels. And so they would transport the people all along that crescent from Pueblo, Colorado, all the way up to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where there were sugar beet factories. So agriculture was one of the businesses that Mexican workers took. The cattle industry, which was started by the Spanish at the time of Christopher Columbus's second voyage. He brought a shipload of longhorn cattle and sheep and pigs to supply the colonists, the Spanish colonists that were being established under the Spanish Empire. And so the free-range grazing in the cattle industry was started by the Spanish in the Americas, all the way from Argentina, all the way up to what is today Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. So the Spanish had not only the cattle industry, but they had huge sheep raising operations, goats, pigs, all kinds of livestock. So, the Mexicans were used to working, and that's where the vaquero culture developed. That really set the pattern for the American cowboy. And when you think about the American cowboy, all of the words, most of the words that are used in the cowboy lingo come from Spanish words. Corral, for example, corral. Rodeo means annual roundup of cattle from free-range grazing to bring them in to brand them, the young calves that are born out on the range, to brand them, to castrate bulls so that they have overproduction and make oxen, good draft animals, and so forth. So all of the methods and the equipment, the saddle with a saddle horn for roping, all of that were developed by the Spanish early on. So the history of the vaquero goes all the way back to, of the American cowboy goes back to the vaqueros and the gauchos and the llaneros of South America, gauchos of Argentina, the vaqueros of Central America and Mexico, and what was Mexico all the way up to the Arkansas River.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. So when did the American cowboy kind of come into, like, what year was that?
Well, as the American settlers moved west,
Mm-hmm.
they did not have the tradition of herding of free range cattle grazing and herding cattle on horseback.
Okay.
That was an innovation that was taken to Spain from Northern Africa. The people of Northern Africa would raise cattle that had migrated from India, those longhorn cattle, and were brought into Northern Africa. And the people of Northern Africa herded cattle on horseback. Then
Really?
when Spain gained its independence from the caliphate of the Islamic world in 1492, Spain was actually inhabited by a caliphate of Northern African groups that were Islamic, and they established the Islamic State all the way up into almost to France in the Iberian Peninsula. So our Spanish heritage, those of us who are Hispanos, really have Northern African heritage in many of the things and ways that we do. Even our words, like if we say, I hope that it doesn't rain today, ojalá, we say, ojalá que no llueva. I hope it doesn't rain, but it really comes from the Arabic. Ojalá means I would to God, Allah. Ojalá. Words like mesa, for example, table, that's an Arabic word. And so many of the other Arabic language spread into Spanish language, mixed with Latin, like all of our names, Chavez, Hernandez, Fernandez, ending with Z's, that comes from the Arabic language.
That's fascinating,
Yeah.
man. Like the origination of languages and
Yeah.
people, you know,
Right.
you
And
would
methods.
never have thought that. Yeah.
Yeah, and methodologies that we use. So the wrangling of cattle on horseback came from Northern Africa. The actual longhorn cattle came from Northern Africa.
Oh, I read about that.
Yeah, and came up to the Americas. Rather, came to the Americas on Christopher Columbus's second voyage. So, I mean, we're all interconnected, I mean, in many different ways. And so if people know history, then they know, hey, these are the origins of things.
Mm-hmm.
When we say lazo, for example, a Spanish vaquero word, which means, you know, making a big loop at the end of a rieta, which is a rope. You know, the vaqueros made their own ropes. They called them larietas. And so the cowboy name is lariat, you know, coming directly from. So many of the cowboy words, sombrero, the 10-gallon hat that the cowboys wore, really, it doesn't have anything to do with gallons of, like we put water in.
Mm-hmm.
It means 10 galones, which are bands around the hat. And if you were a very accomplished, because the vaqueros would, after they had done the rodeo, the spring rodeo, and brought the cattle in, branded them, castrated them, and then turned them back out to pasture, open pastures, they would have just competitions. And so the vaqueros would have those competitions. And if they the ones that were the greatest competitors would get a band around their hat. And they called that band a galón. In Spanish, it would be el gallón. And so all of the white settlers, as they came, they would see the vaqueros doing these things, and they picked up those practices because that was the most efficient way to herd large herds of cattle. And so all of the methodology of ranching and the cowboy culture that we see today, including the rodeos, you know, where they're riding and roping calves and riding bulls and all that. The Spanish were doing it, and the Spanish and Mexican vaqueros the gauchos down in South America and the llaneros in upper South America. So they were doing these competitions and gaining recognition by the gallones that they had around their head.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. And then to go back on the mobile homes, so these homes would just be, they'd follow along with them along the railroad.
Well,
and
people would live in them, so they would go in that crescent that I was talking about, and plant the sugar beet plants. Then, so after the planting was done, they'd come back and cultivate them with they had a little short hoe, and if you go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., you'll see a whole history of the sugar beet industry and the Mexicano laborers. And it was back-breaking work to weed around the sugar beet plant. So they had to bend over, and they used these little short handled hoes that they would cultivate the plants. So they'd go through and cultivate them, again, riding on their train, the homes that they had on their trains. And then they would come back around and harvest. And so you had to pull them out of the ground, chop off the tops and throw them into a big pile.
And were these homes just for workers, or did they have actually their families traveling along?
Oh, they had their families. Here's the thing about Mexican migration is that to this country, is that most of the industries they engaged in, the farmers, in the case of agriculture, needed year-round workers. The sugar beet crop needed year-round workers. They didn't need seasonal workers. Now, migrant workers who just came in to pick stuff, they can be seasonal workers. And that's what Cesar Chavez was all about, making sure that those seasonal workers were treated right.
Yeah.
But in the times in industry, agricultural industries, they needed the whole family there so that the guys weren't going back and forth all the time. The same thing was true with farms in Kansas City. I mean, up by Turner, there was a large number of Belgian farmers that had migrated there. They grew potatoes, they grew other crops, truck crops, and they needed the workers to actually live close by. The same thing with the railroads. The railroads needed year-round workers. The meatpacking industry needed year-round workers. The hospitality industry needed full-time, year-round workers. And so to have that, they had to bring their families with us. And that's really how the migration to Kansas City, especially during the 1910 to 1930 period, a lot of people from Tangancicuaro, Michoacan, Mexico, came to Kansas City, settled in Argentine area to work the railroads, the meat packing. A lot of people on the west side were also. So the people who came up from Tangancicuaro, from Guadalajara and other places in Mexico to work, settled in those, what we called the Colonia Mexicana, the Mexican Colonia community, all the way from Turner, Kansas, all the way to the west side. And that's the area that I discovered when I first came here in 1961 and began to try to document the stories and histories of that area.
That's amazing, man. I mean, just to hear where everything comes from and just the backstory of Kansas City. And I mean, you even blew my mind about, the words, the origination of the words that are being used, today. I know we're a little short on time today. I know you have another interview coming up. But I'd love to get you in again and we can go from there on. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, man. I
think the next time we meet, we could talk about some of the institutions that were developed, like the Guadalupe Center, like Mexican American baseball and fast-pitch softball, about the Unión Cultural Mexicana. So a lot of things were established.
The Great Flood, too. You sent me that. Actually, I'm really fascinated about that. I didn't even know that happened.
The what?
The Great Flood.
Oh, yeah. 1951 flood.
Some of the pictures, I mean, were just families outside their home, knee deep in water.
Exactly.
It's it's insane. But, you know, really puts into perspective, like on actual struggle that people had to go through back then, you know? But yeah, no, Gene, I really appreciate you coming on. I think you're right, man. Just having the backstory on is the true, like, that's exactly what we needed, is to know exactly where the origination came from. And it kind of sets everything up to understand it a lot better.
Good.
But you gave me this right here. What is this?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a visiting professor that we have coming up to Kansas City. I first met this professor, Dr. Jorge Fregoso Torres. He's actually a friend of Maria Chauran, who happens to be my daughter's mother-in-law, the Chauran family. They own the restaurant, El Taquito La Fonda, down on the boulevard, Summit and Southwest Boulevard. And Maria's story is a fascinating story, and her family story is a great one. To sometime you may want to have her on to talk about her history.
No, for sure.
Yeah, but anyway, in 1998, I was a counselor at J.C. Harmon High School, and so I met. What I noticed at the high school was that there were a lot of Mexicano and other Latino kids who had a lot of artistic ability. And I knew that B. Sanchez had come into the presidency of the Kansas City Art Institute. And so I met with B. Sanchez over at the Art Institute, and I said, B, we have so many talented young Latinos that really would benefit from some of the teaching at the Art Institute. I said, how about if we did a summer program, brought kids from all of the area, Latino kids from all of the area high schools into the Art Institute to experience teachers in various studios like painting and drawing, sculpting, ceramics, fabrics. And she said, that's a wonderful idea. Let's do it. So we got a grant from the Kauffman Foundation, and we started a summer program at the Art Institute with B. Sanchez and others at the Art Institute. And there were a number of Mexicano teachers there working at the Art Institute as teachers. And so we engaged them and some other teachers to work with our youth. In the summertime. We would pick them up all over the city, take them for a Saturday, day-long activity at the Art Institute. And we, for about a 8-week period in the summer. Out of that grew a relationship with the Guadalajara connection through Maria Chauran. She said, hey, I have an artist friend down in Guadalajara, so we'd like to connect you guys. And so we planned a trip, taking some of the teachers from the Art Institute and even a student to go down with us to Guadalajara to meet Jorge and to paint some murals on his wife's elementary school and teach classes in her elementary school. So I headed up a project with the LULAC Educational Service Center, help funded, and a couple of other funders. And we took a group of artists down to Guadalajara and met Jorge Fregoso Torres. He was an instructor at the University of Guadalajara in the School of Architecture, Art, and Design. And so we had a wonderful time, not only painting there, but also painting a mural in a school in Tangancicuaro, again, where a lot of Mexican immigrants came from, in a little town in Michoacan. And then when we came back, we kept the connection with Jorge. He was scheduled to come up to Kansas City in 2020. He had his visa and everything was ready, but then COVID shut everything down. Couldn't do anything. And in the meantime, Jorge passed away of kidney failure.
Man.
And so I attended his funeral some weeks back, and talking to his wife, I said, Rebecca, is there a professor that could come up and do what Jorge was going to do? And she said, well, nobody knows his work better than I do. So she's actually in flight right now, coming from Guadalajara. She had a layover in Houston, but she'll be here sometime today. And all next week, she's going to be doing presentations in various venues throughout the city with the support of many entities, organizations, the Kansas City Museum, Sister Cities, Guadalajara Committee, KCK Art Gallery, and Wyandotte County Historical Society. Many entities are going to be supporting her series of lectures that she's giving, not only about her husband's work, but of her own work, because she's worked at the university for 22 years as a professor in the same department.
This episode will actually drop next week, but if you want, you could send that to me and I'll definitely share it on the page. Perfect. That way people can know about that, because I know next she's going to be here from April 1st to the 6th.
That's right. I'll send that this evening.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. No, awesome, Gene. I want to shout out Vania Soto. She's the one who introduced me about you. So without that DVD, that Sante Fe Trail, I wouldn't have known you even existed, to be honest. I mean, when I watched that DVD and, you know, and seen you in there talking about, you know, everything, I was like, man, I got to meet this guy, you know, because, I mean, it's incredible, the backstory of Kansas City and, you know, even all the way down into New Mexico. So even in New Mexico. So, but no, man, it was great. I want to thank you for coming on. Is there anything that you want to talk about before you go? Any ways to reach you, or any ways to access some of this information that we talked about?
Well, I'm presently serving, and actually for the last several years, I started with the Kansas City Museum 10 years ago, actually going on 11. So in 2013, I did an exhibit on the Mexican musicians that came here from Mexico, like Lupe M. Gonzalez Orchestra, for example. His dad played in a band. Actually, it was more of a Mexican music band called the Gay Rancheros. And back then, gay meant happy. It didn't mean what it means today.
Okay.
But so the Gay Rancheros had a large orchestra. Then actually one that was led by Mr. Zamora actually was called the Rio Grande Serenaders. And that was a large Mexican orchestra. So I told their story. I told Lupe, because Lupe's dad had played bass, big stand-up acoustical bass with the Rio Grande Serenaders. Then they started the Gay Rancheros. And then that led Lupe as a young man to start picking up instruments. And his story was that he said, I must have heard the thump, thump, thump of my dad's bass in my mother's womb, because I had an instant love of music as a kid. And he started the Lupe M. Gonzalez Orchestra, which played big band music, but with a Latino twist to it. And so I told the story of Mexican musicians coming to Kansas City at the Kansas City Museum in 2013 and did an exhibit of artifacts and told that history. And so I've been working at the museum ever since. So I can be reached at gtchavez45@gmail.com if anybody's interested in learning about some of the work that I do. And I'll send that to you as well. Yeah. But my contact information, I would love to talk to others who have stories to tell. Oh, yeah. What I'm doing for the Kansas City Museum regularly is doing oral history interviews, much like the interview that you're doing here with me. And I air them on One Kansas City Radio. So you can go to the website of One Kansas City Radio and hear some of those oral history. Yeah,
you guys have neat conversations on there, you know, especially some of the one I heard about the World War II vet, I believe, or World War I? The Latino, the first casualty in World War I.
Oh, right. Ralph Cifuentes. Yeah. Very good. After whom American Legion Post was named there in the West Side. Yeah. Right.
No, that's awesome. I look forward to following your work, Gene. It's incredible work. But I will appreciate you coming on.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.